I'm Ernie Rea, and this is the Beyond Belief podcast. Today we're discussing the ego. We all have one, although some are bigger than others. Ego is simply the Latin word for I, so none of us can escape it. But is our social media world in danger of becoming obsessed with the ego? Could a healthy sense of ego be a positive influence on our lives? What do our religious traditions say about the ego? Joining me in the studio are Ajmal Masroor, an imam, Lucy Winkett, a priest, and Dav Panesar, a Sikh and practitioner of mindfulness. I began by asking Dav if he thought the ego was a good or a bad thing.
It's a necessary thing that is indispensable, but it's something that is nothing more than a virtual reality.
Lucy?
I think it depends how you're using it and what stage in your life as to whether you want to attach a kind of moral value to it, good or bad. But I think it is what it is.
Ajmal?
Ego is the dark, shady self of a thing that I don't want people to see or hear about. It's all about me. It's the self-validation that I often look for, the accolade that I long, the approval that I seek from people. Sometimes it's all about me is manifested in my iPad, in my iPhone, in my this, in my that. That to me is the problem of ego.
Well, I want to look at it from a faith perspective. So, Dav, as a Sikh, how would you define the ego?
I think the first problem is that the misappropriation of the Freudian terms of the ego on the teachings of the Sikhs. The Sikhs have a very sophisticated understanding of the mind. So when we say ego, what part are we referring to? Because I think Freudian understanding of the sense of I is very much different from the Eastern understanding of the sense of I.
But I presume that the ego was the essential me.
Well, what do we mean by the essential me? So when you are dreaming and you know that you're dreaming, which part of you is watching that dream? Is it the ego that's actually participating in the dream? And is it consciousness that's observing it? So within a Sikh perspective, what we're looking at is the sense of I, the sense of self, is a manufactured reality, which is indispensable in our functioning in everyday life. However, it is not your essential sense of self, your consciousness.
Lucy?
I mean, Christians would say that people, human beings, are made in the image of God. And for Christians, the nature of God is relationship in terms of the Trinity. So God is not simply the three persons of the Trinity, Creator, Christ and Holy Spirit. God is the movement between those three persons. That then raises a question, is there anything that is simply irreducibly me, a soul, a single entity that is irreducibly me? If we want to follow the doctrine of creation, then we would say no, that I am in relationship with myself as much as I am in relationship with other people. And in terms of a Christian ethic of living, it's a kind of other-centred ethic. So Christians often talk about giving themselves away, again in mirroring what Christians believe God is up to in the universe and on the earth, which is simply pouring God's self out in love.
Ajmal?
In Islam, there are three elements that we often talk about: the body, the mind, and the soul. Body ages, body becomes frail and weak, body withers away, but the mind cannot be in the same realm as the body, because mind is more intangible, though there is an element of tangibility within it. Soul, the very essence of your life that is heavenly and divine, ever living, never dies, is the real you. When that departs you, you're gone. So the dream element that you talked about, Dav, it's not you who's watching the dream, it's your soul's experience of world and beyond the world from the Islamic perspective that comes in. The ego, the negative element of ego, is about how highly do I worth myself. If I think I'm better than you, that's my ego talking. However, my soul will talk when I see you as my equal, when I relate to you at that relational perspective, as Lucy said. So to me, it's the soul-centered life that we are missing at the expense at this moment in time and giving more importance to I and ego.
Dav?
If we use the term consciousness, because I think soul is quite misleading certainly from a Sikh perspective, because soul somehow suggests that you're separated from the whole.
Do you separate consciousness from the soul?
No. What I'm saying is the ground of reality, all existence, is conscious at its very base. It's the ground of reality. Out of this consciousness, through vibrations and through frequencies, this consciousness manifests itself in multitude forms. Out of consciousness arises the mind. Out of the mind arises the sense of self. Out of the sense of self, we have interactions. So from a Sikh perspective, I would suggest that it's something analogous to existence being the ocean, and each individual being a ice cube or ice crystal within that ocean, so no different from existence
Whereas
itself.
in the Islamic perspective, the conscience is also powered by the soul. I agree with you in the sense that we don't need to separate them as 3 or 4 different entities. They're all integral part of life. But the most important part of life, the one that we consider to be alive, I believe, is the soul. And if you lose the soul or not feed the soul enough, that vacuum would be filled by the ego. You know, I see people desperately longing for awards, and they're paying people to give them award. To me, that's ego.
Lucy?
I think I'd like to speak up for the ego a little bit. I mean, I think we're all trying to find language to reach for something that is ultimately mysterious and probably and possibly unknowable. Having said that, I do want to stick up for the ego a little bit, because I think there is a gendered aspect to this. I think that if, in religious terms, and I can only speak from a Christian perspective, there has been a kind of system of historic exclusion of a particular section of humanity, for example, women, then what women need to learn to do is inhabit their ego before they are then asked to give it away. So in Christianity, you would say, love your neighbour as yourself. That's a classic Christian ethic. You have to have a self to love in order to know how to love others as you would love yourself.
And ego is what drives achievement and ambition, Ajmal.
Yes, but that's not the same thing as putting myself beyond and above everybody else. I think one of the things I want to disagree with Lucy here for a second is that I don't think it's a gender-centric issue. I think ego is ego, regardless of whether you're a male or a female.
I agree that we've all got one,
Yeah,
but I think that how you inhabit that ego is societally defined and historically defined.
That's not a gender-centric discussion in the sense that I believe so the devils fall in the heavens. If we go back to the Abrahamic story of Adam and Eve, from the Islamic perspective, devil thought he was better than Adam or Eve, both of them. That betterness, that ego, has been the primordial problem and for entire human race.
Lucy?
Well, I don't disagree with the fact that women and men both have egos. What I think I'm arguing for is there is a different pathway to self-acceptance and a different pathway to being able to give yourself away, which for Christians is the ultimate goal. So what Christians would say is that God is self-giving. The Greek word would be kenosis. If Christians are asked to live a kenotic life, as in give themselves away, then they have to have a self. They have to understand themselves in order to give themselves away. Historically, that knowledge has been unequally spread, and it's not good enough just to claim a kind of universal sense of the ego for every section of humanity, when it's patently obvious that some people have expressed their egos much more forcefully than others.
Dav?
From a Sikh perspective, ego is a sense of separation. When you're born, do you have an ego? No, from a Sikh perspective, that ego is cultivated through conditioning. And even when we are talking about good and bad, that's simply 2 facets of the same thing, 2 sides of the same coin. It's a conditioned sense of reality. So if I am brought up in an Islamic faith, then my ego is cultivated within those conditions. If I'm in a Christian paradigm, then it's in Christian conditioning.
But is that ego? That's your experience. And experience and ego are very different elements.
On the contrary, I think the Sikh's worldview is very accurate about the mind. So I asked you right at the start, which part of the mind are we talking about in terms of ego? So within the Sikh internal structure, man, chit, buddh, hankar, 4 words, ho, home, 6. These are 6 different components, structures, matrix and representation of your sense of self. When you're born, according to the Sikh worldview, the sense of differentiation doesn't exist. That sense of differentiation is what is cultivated through your education, through your religion, through all the input that you have with the world.
So you're talking about the intellectual input as well as the experience, not the ego here.
No, I'm not. And hence, I think the Freudian understanding of ego is misleading from a non-egocentric tradition.
I agree with that,
Yeah?
because
So-
I'm not a subscriber of Freud. However, I'm saying that ego should not be confused with knowledge.
No,
Just to explain what you think
Yeah,
the Freudian concept of ego is.
That is, it's central to your identity, and it's a fixed structure. Those are the two key components of Freudian understanding of the ego. Within the Sikh worldview, no, it's a cultivated identity, and it's an identity which is secondary. We take it as a primary identity. In fact, if we look at the world, most of the problems in this world are ego-based problems, whether they're religious, political, or any other.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing the ego. In this age of social media, where the opportunities to share your inner feelings, even your inner self, with a wide audience seem endless, are we in danger of being obsessed with our own egos? And with Mir Ajmal Masroor, Dav Panesar and Lucy Winkett. Martina Purdy spent 25 years working as a high-profile journalist in Northern Ireland. She was a regular presence on television and radio. Her decision to quit and become a nun came as a shock to many people. She'd spent her working life chasing a story, keeping up her on-screen appearances, progressing her career.
I had a fantastic job at the BBC. I had what a lot of people would say was a dream job. I was the political correspondent covering the Stormont Assembly. I spent about 15 years covering the ups and downs of the political process here.
Did you enjoy seeing yourself on television?
Yes. Well, yes and no. If I looked okay, yes. But, if you're looking at the TV and you're going, oh, you just see the flaws and you're like, oh, turn it off. Or one way to get me out of bed in the morning was if I had to hear my own voice, I'd be jumping right into the shower. But yes, I did enjoy it. I enjoyed all the trappings of it. You go out and people say hello and they're very nice. And I suppose when I thought about, leaving the BBC, initially I thought, maybe I'm called to do aid work in the third world. I'm like, but I won't be Martina Purdy from the BBC anymore. And, who am I without kind of that title and those trappings that go with it? And really that had nothing to do with who I really was, but I had to figure that out.
What made you decide that you were going to leave the BBC and become a nun?
I suppose I went to Peru when I was about 40, and I was named after St. Martin de Porres. St. Martin of the Poor was the first black saint. And I went to pray at the church there, and I was having a very nice time in what was a very poor country. I was eating in the best of restaurants, staying in nice places, and it didn't sit well with me, and I didn't feel good about it. And I felt that my life was so centered on myself. It was all about me. It was really too easy. So I prayed there that the Lord would help me to change. And but I said, not yet, Lord. Like, I'm not ready for anything too radical, but to help me to change. And, as time went on, things happened to me. Doors started to open. I started to do charity work. As part of that charity work, a friend of mine asked me to go up to a prayer service, a mass and adoration in St. Michael's Church in West Belfast. And I went, and I thought it was really beautiful because it was all guitars and music. And I thought, gosh, this is really amazing. And I thought I must come back here. And the more I went, the more that became like this amazing part of my week. And when I had to present Stormont live on a Monday night from Stormont, or Stormont Today rather, I was disappointed, and I thought, I can't go to St. Michael's tonight. So I suppose I found something better than being on television talking to politicians. I found that the Lord, He was everything.
What sort of a relationship do you have with your ego now?
Well, I would say it's a daily battle. I read recently that, the choice is not Jesus and the devil. The choice is between Jesus and me. So my ego does still rear its head, and I have to give that to the Lord and ask for help in making sure that I stay centered on Him. I suppose from a Christian point of view, the ego is that false self. That self that sometimes tells you you're not good enough or tells you you're better than someone else. And both of those statements are wrong. You are a beloved child of God. So when I am centered on God, I'm not thinking about myself all the time. And when I am at peace with myself, at peace with God, I'm at peace with my neighbor, and I'm thinking about someone else. My career, I suppose, was all about me, and now I'm thinking about what can I do to help someone else.
You've gone through a huge external physical change. Has that affected an inner spiritual change?
At first, I was thinking about the superficial things that would change. And, I really loved clothes. I would shop for Europe, and I loved makeup and getting my hair done. And at my last year at the BBC, I wore less and less makeup, but I always said that I will never give up my mascara. It will have to be prized from my cold, dead fingers. But, it was the last thing to go in the convent. The night before I became a postulant, I dyed my eyelashes black for the last time. And I haven't looked back. And now I have dark hair and blonde eyelashes, but that's how the Lord made me. I have to live with it.
Every so often, doesn't your ego say to you, come on, you don't have to be doing this. You could be doing anything you like.
It does. Yes, at first, you're used to having a car. You give up a car, and then you might want the community car for something, and the answer is no. And then, as I call it, my inner Robert De Niro is like, are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? So you have to know yourself. But one thing you do learn in community is you learn all your flaws. Now, people create this ego to try to hide from their flaws because it's so painful to look at our flaws. But as a Christian, we're taught, know yourself. Yes, I'm not perfect. I might be full of pride. I might be selfish at times. I have a bad temper. I'm impatient. But there's lots of good things about me. And what you do is you list your bad things, you list your good things, and you draw a circle around that. You say, this is me. This is the whole me, and God loves me just as I am. And sometimes those little flaws in me, they can serve the good too, the shade and the light.
That was Sister Martina Purdy. Lucy, can you understand her decision to leave the bright lights and become a nun?
Of course. I love the way she talked about her inner Robert De Niro. I mean, that's fantastic. I think that what she's put so well is that inner dialogue, which perhaps we are reaching for a bit here, to say you might have a sense that your kind of inner competitiveness, comes out, and you're having a conversation with somebody, but you're not really listening to that person. You're thinking about what you're going to say next. It's something that is a daily occurrence for people who are human beings. So I think she's really describing that inner dialogue, that inner conversation, and the choice that she's made is to dedicate her life to God. But that doesn't stop the conversation and the inner dialogue happening all day, every day. I thought that was very compelling.
Dav, it struck me as I was listening to that interview that she had a sort of Eastern sense of detachment from worldly goods.
Yeah, I suppose the real attachment should be the detachment from your sense of ego as opposed to worldly goods. However, I think within the Judeo-Christian kind of a worldview, God is external and we are serving God, etc., etc. Whereas within the Sikh worldview, God is within. In fact, there is nothing that is not God. And therefore, the thing that prevents us from knowing God is knowing ourselves. And the best way to know ourselves is to first know what we are not. And what we are not is our sense of self called the ego.
I think in the Islamic tradition, knowing yourself is an essential part of knowing God. If you forget yourself, you forget God. This is in the Quran. You'll find this often described by the saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him. I think the biggest part of what I learned from the interview that you took was the Robert De Niro inside was talking in my head too. I was thinking to myself, what does it say to me every time I wake up in the morning? Actually, it says, you were dead a second ago. You've just woken up. Be grateful. And then when I wake up in the morning, that's the first thing that says, hey, I'm alive and I'm awake. Not because I'm narcissistic, not because my ego is wanting to dominate, but I'm just grateful for having a life. When I can do that on a regular basis, I take your word about consciousness. I'm conscious that I was given a life to live. And in that servitude, I find God in me and outside.
Lucy, listening to Martina, I thought, if there were more nuns like her, there might be more people going into a convent. But at the same time, it's not for everybody. She gave up it all. Yeah. And clearly it was the right decision for her. Yeah. But there has to be a sort of balance.
Yes, of course. And I think exactly as you say, you can hear the kind of joy in her voice. So for her, this was the path that has brought her to kind of fulfilled life. And of course, that decision isn't for everybody. everybody, but I think what she's describing is a set of choices which are recognisable to anybody. All those who are still working at the BBC, former colleagues of hers, and wherever you're working or whatever you're doing, those kind of inner conversations are recognisable. And for some people, it is clearly, a joyful choice to walk away from the possessions and the car and the mascara, as she described it. For others, it's possible to sit lightly to those things, perhaps, or to hold them in an unclenched fist, not to hang on to them as if they were the meaning of your life, but to live kind of open-handedly and open-heartedly in the world as it is.
There's a very beautiful saying that you can have as much money as you like as long as it stays in your pocket. But the moment it enters your heart, that's when it has taken over, or the ego has taken over. When it says it's in the pocket, it means you're able to share it with the poor and the needy. You're able to share with those who are most vulnerable. I also find the concept of ego often bothering me. I was having a row with my brother the other day. Major row, and we couldn't resolve a problem that's been going on for years and years. So eventually I came home and I said to myself, that's not me and him. That's our ego in battle. And I wrote to him saying, do you think it's our ego in battle? It took him 3 days to write back to me saying, yes, it is our ego. And guess what? We're able to resolve it in 5 seconds because we both recognized it's not us. It's what we put ourselves as more important than the other that was in conflict.
Sure. And the conflict that we have within ourselves is actually a conflict between yourself with the ego that's split. So particularly when we have doctrines that are saying this is what it means to be good, you automatically understand what it means to be bad. So the whole idea of self-esteem, self-respect, self-worth, these are facets of your ego. So your ego is always having a conversation with itself.
I want to move on to talk about the ego in modern society. And it does seem to me that today, perhaps more than in the generation when I was growing up, there is this extraordinary need to be liked. If you look at Twitter and Facebook, people are constantly posting and you have an opportunity to put a little tick and a smile and say, yes, I like that as a response. And I wonder, have these impact on people's sense of their own self-worth, Lucy?
I think there's a really important balance to be struck here in religious terms. And what I observe is in Twitter particularly, which I look at most days, I can see that people are kind of shoring each other up and by turn hoping that someone is going to shore them up by the ticks and the likes, etc., and the kind of affirmatory comments. At the same time, I think it's really important that a kind of proper and grounded and deep sense of self-worth is something that, responsible religious teachers will want to encourage. That's not a bad thing, is to accept yourself at a very deep level. What I observe in the Twitter sphere is that we've got kind of stuck as a culture. So the kind of, the advertising slogans, because you're worth it, deeply, that's a true statement. But at the same time, what we've done is get stuck and place our trust in a whole set of attitudes and responses from other people and indeed possessions that convince us of our self-worth, which only then reveals the kind of chasm that is actually there. So for kind of spiritual teaching, it's really important to, as I was saying before, to sit lightly to that affirmation and to sit lightly to the need for approval, which by the way is a welcome to the human race moment. Everybody wants approval and affirmation, but to sit lightly to it and know that your worth is located somewhere else as a child of God.
This week I read that the ego is only bad when it is fragile. And when I think of people going on social media and looking for signs of approval, it's saying to me that there is something fragile about their sense of themselves, about their self-worth, that they need this sort of affirmation.
And I go one step further. It's not just Twitter, the Instagram and the Snapchat generation that we have, constantly taking photographs. And they need approval, validation. People commit suicide when they don't get enough validations, and it's happening amongst the young people on a regular basis. The materialistic world in which we are now nurturing this self-worth notion, or the definition of self-worth, is very destructive. And that's why I often say to people, if you only feed your tangible self will perish. But your intangible self that will live on, called the soul, and will be accountable as far as the Islamic tradition is concerned, in the hereafter will be starving. So the way to keep away from this self-regeneration, as we call it, I believe, is to give people more alternative ways of discovering their self-worth.
Dav, I'd love to know how a Sikh regards the celebrity culture that we see today, the number of self-help books that are coming out, the cosmetic surgery that, again, seems to be speaking to a sense of lack of self-worth, the me generation. What in terms of ego, what do you make of that?
I think it completely demonstrates how we are in a vacuum, a spiritual vacuum at the moment. I introduced the Sikh worldview, Ik Oankar, one whole existence being God, for a better word. Then my sense of self changes if I am part and parcel of that. I think when we are divorced from that, we need to create some level of sense of worth. And I think, yes, it is a problem. It is something that is infecting every part of the community, whether it's Sikhs, non-Sikhs. However, it is the ego that's creating virtual egos to admire itself. So it's simply repetitive programming. What we've been programmed and conditioned in the first place to have, we are simply creating other virtual realities, other personas. So it's the egos creating more egos.
Lucy, I think it's got to be said that there is a worth to social media. It's not all bad.
Of course. I think all social media is doing, in its negative aspects, which are well rehearsed, is amplifying what has already been there. So, it's simply putting a megaphone to some of our erupting needs that the ego demands, which is about exactly affirmation and people telling us that we're doing well.
I want to ask each one of you a final, somewhat tongue-in-cheek question before we bring this programme to a close. And I'll come to you first, Dav. If your ego was talking to you now, what would it be saying?
It would be saying to me, know that I am a virtual reality, cultivate me into a healthy reality. Remember that you have an ego, but you're not your ego.
Lucy?
Probably something quite similar, actually. I think my ego would be saying, don't worry about what people think about your performance in this programme.
Ajmal?
Don't talk. That's what my ego would tell me. Stop talking.
Well, that's all for this week. My thanks to Lucy Winkett, Ajmal Masroor and Dav Panesar.